So on behalf of the India-Oxford Initiative and the Ashmolean Museum, I'd like to give a really warm welcome to our audiences both online and here in this room. Today, we are delighted to have with us two distinguished architectural historians. Professor Esther de Costa Meyer is Professor Emerita at Princeton and visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture. A native of Brazil, Esther specializes in issues of cultural translation, focusing on buildings erected by colonial powers in the global south, as well as the emerging cultures of resistance that were both highly creative and resilient. Of her many publications, I can only mention two today. Her recent book, Dividing Paris, Urban Renewal and Social Inequality, 1852 to 1870, was published last year by Princeton University Press. Her book, published this year by Yale University Press, is On Sassoons, co-authored with Claudia Nason. The book accompanies their co-curated current exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York City. This exceptional exhibition and book follow 4 generations of the Sassoons, a Baghdadi Jewish family highlighting their pioneering role in trade, art collecting, and architectural patronage in Iraq, India, China, and the United Kingdom. The title of Esther's lecture today is The Sassoons and Architectural Heritage, and she will focus mainly on structures in India, and I think a little bit on China as well, Esther. We are very grateful to Esther for agreeing to join us here in Oxford and to share her research with all of us. I'm also very grateful to Professor William Whyte, who moved a prior engagement to join us and moderate the discussion today. William is Professor of Social and Architectural History at Oxford. He is especially intrigued by what the serious investigation of the built and natural environment does to existing accounts of modern history. Author of several books that focus on architecture, including, and again, I'm only going to focus on 2, Red Brick, A Social and Architectural History of Britain's Civic Universities, and Unlocking the Church, The Lost Secrets of Victorian Sacred Space, both amongst many others, published by Oxford University Press. William is currently serving as Senior Responsible Owner and Chair of Project Board for the Stephen A. Schwarzman Center for the Humanities, the university's largest ever capital project, the result of the largest ever gift given to Oxford. It is absolutely a privilege to be opening in such a professional company and an honor to introduce our speaker and moderator. My name is Malika Kumbera Landris. I am the keeper of the Eastern Art Department at the Ashmolean, fellow of St. Cross College and chair of the India-Oxford Initiative in Oxford. As a reminder, we are live streaming and the video will be subsequently available on our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kumbera Landris, for this wonderful, wonderful introduction, all too generous, and for the invitation to come here. It is a joy as well as an honor to be back at the Ashmolean. I also want to thank you for the hospitality. And I want to thank Marva Ahmed for all her help in the logistics. This is works in progress. It was done during a pandemic, in fact, during the lockdown. And so much of the archival work still remains to be done. And with their linguistic skills, only our South Asian and Chinese colleagues can help do justice to the important role played by other actors, other social groups in the buildings, whose collaboration are essential to the buildings erected by the Sassoons in different cities overseas. Furthermore, the architecture of the family cuts across many, many fields, which are beyond the expertise of a single scholar. In a well-known passage from a famous book, the historian and political scientist Benedict Anderson said, The novel is a complex gloss on the word meanwhile. And while not a novel, the story of the Sassoons, while they were in diaspora, also offers a rich and bewildering commentary on that same adverb. There are so many Sassoons, and all of them seem to be endowed with ubiquity and simultaneity. After 1858, there were always a couple of Sassoons in London, a couple in India, a couple in China, one coming back from Japan, other in Baghdad, and they built in all those places. So it's not possible to tell the story in a linear way as I'm going to do today, let alone in 40 minutes. So the Sassoons, as Professor Kumbera-Landers were saying, left Baghdad, were from Iraq. They left Baghdad due to religious persecution in 1830, a flight that would lead the family through a long transcultural trajectory. After a brief stint in Iran, he settled in Bombay, now Mumbai, but I will continue to call it Bombay. And you see him here in this portrait, painted before his death. He is dressed in Baghdadi robes and turban, not in Indian clothing. And it represents Malabar Hill with the Arabian Sea in the background. Malabar Hill was a very upscale suburb of, as we would say today, of Bombay, where the Sassoons had built very, very grand homes. David Sassoon trained his 8 sons in business from a young age and rotated them through Hong Kong, Shanghai, Baghdad, and several other cities before settling in London, where the family finally found a permanent home. He was a businessman of genius, trading in spices, cotton, wool, pearls, and eventually opium. Opium was crucial for British economy as a way to balance the trade deficit with China. The Industrial Revolution had enriched Great Britain, which wanted more luxury goods, tea, porcelain, silks. But in exchange, the Chinese wanted nothing but silver. And this led the British Navy to engage in a series of naval skirmishes with China, which constituted the First Opium War, 1839 to 42. The resulting Treaty of Nanjing ceded Hong Kong to the British and imposed the opium trade on 5 ports initially, including Shanghai, the biggest catch of them all. The French and the Americans followed suit, and later the Russians and the Japanese all wanted a part. All these nations wanted a part in the opium market. This talk focuses largely on the architecture that Sassoons built in diaspora, a span of roughly 100 years, sandwiched between Baghdad and London. And it will cover mainly the public buildings of this family, which have survived in greater numbers in Bombay and in Shanghai. They left over 200 buildings in Asia. No one knows really how many. Residence and commercial buildings, as well as synagogues, schools, cultural institutions, and hospitals. The Sassoons were Mizrahi, Jews from the Middle East, and had a long history of cultural assimilation. They were multilingual and at home in many cultures. David Sassoon and his sons spoke Hebrew, they spoke Arabic, they spoke Turkish because they were Ottoman subjects, they spoke Persian, the language of business, and they learned Hindustani. The children also learned English, though David never did. His sons and daughters trade inured them to diversity and encouraged the cultural richness that characterized all members of the family. That is the great polyglot, multicultural tradition of the Baghdadi Jews. And Bombay, of course, had its own polyglot citizenry and its own rich cultural diversity, and it was a place where they could flourish. Diaspora involved the Sassoons in an ongoing interplay between place and identity. In India and China, they were thrust into a position of compulsory originality. There was no roadmap. They had to reinvent themselves in Bombay, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and the UK. But being a Baghdadi Jew in Bombay was not the same thing as being a Baghdadi Jew in Shanghai, let alone London. Furthermore, the move from Baghdad to Bombay hurtled them into the spokes of the Industrial Revolution. They were merchants, but within a few years of David's death, his sons would become industrialists as well. So the Sassoon story of assimilation exemplifies the sea change that Jewish communities underwent in the 19th century. as Ethan Katz, Lisa Lev, and Maud Mandel have pointed out, the assimilationist demands of liberal nation states shaped the paths of Jews' transformation in the modern world, which led through different ways to increased political, social, cultural, and economic integration. Integration is the key word, cultural and political. So architecture is going to play a major role in this transformation. So this is a story of change in the making. And you see it here in this well-known photograph of David Sassoon with his three sons. Only one is wearing Western clothing because his father is about to send him off to the UK, to London, to establish a beachhead for the family in 1858. Already suggests what will happen to the family. The four generations I'm focusing on, the ones in diaspora, would be born in different countries and eventually acquire different mother tongues. By the third generation, there were a couple of Anglican Sassoons. By the fourth, a Roman Catholic, the poet Siegfried Sassoon, and the late life Buddhist, Victor Sassoon. In other words, theirs is a story of rupture and continuity, of exile and continual assimilation. The death of David Sassoon, who remained close to Baghdadi customs, will accelerate the Anglicization of the family, as you see in this photograph, taken 5 years after his death. In the case of communities that migrated to colonial territories, the process of acculturation was asymmetrical. Despite the impact of India on the Baghdadi Jews, they began what became a long process of assimilation to English customs. But of course, one might say that David Sassoon paved the way for this transformation. A consummate strategist, he was the secular leader of the Baghdadi Jews in Bombay and wanted to raise the profile of the stateless community. Architecture was one of the means that he used, a tool of self-representation. That is, he made sure that the buildings he commissioned blended in with the prevailing stylistic tastes of the Raj. The Magen David Synagogue, the first synagogue of Baghdadi Jews in Bombay, which you see on your right, was a case in point. In 1851, when he was well established, David Sassoon bought an imposing house in Baikula, about 5.5 miles from the center of Bombay. And there, close to his house, he noticed that the Anglicans had built a compound in 1833 with a place of worship, Christ Church, and a school, which is off to the left, not shown in the photograph. So David did the same, establishing a compound of his own, a large compound, which came to have a synagogue, a school, a dispensary, a ritual bath or mikvah, a matzo oven, etc. Both the church and the synagogue go back to the same model. James Gibbs' St. Martin in the Fields, which became the prototype of Anglican churches around the world. It was influential because Gibbs published it with plans, elevations, and variations. Choosing an English example was particularly important after David Sassoon became a British citizen in 1853. By then, the preferred style in both Britain and India was the Neo-Gothic. But by going back to the language of classicism, David Sassoon was respecting the urban context, since his synagogue is a few minutes on foot from Christ Church. As the Sassoon enterprises grew, they brought more and more co-religionists from Baghdad to work for them on their businesses. And soon the synagogue became too small. It was restored and enlarged by David's grandson, Jacob Sassoon, in 1910. Jacob also had to rebuild the adjoining school from scratch, renaming it the Sir Jacob Sassoon School. By then, Jacob was pretty much alone caring for the family's charitable institutions in Bombay. His uncles and his brothers had all succumbed to the gravitational pull of London, even though the brothers still spent a few years working on family businesses. In Pune, where the Sassoons and the elites of Bombay spent the monsoon months, David Sassoon built another beautiful synagogue, Ohel David, which again looks like the Anglican Church St. Paul's, which was being built not far away at the very same time. Both neo-Gothic structures are unusual in that they are entered through a portico at the front, where there's also a steeple. And the interior of Ohel David is very airy and beautiful, but it still looks very much like an Anglican church. Now, Sassoon's architectural choices may well have been perceived by the colonial powers as proofs of allegiance to the crown, but his purpose was to maintain and protect the status of the Baghdadi Jews. Sir Bartle Frere, the governor of Bombay, acknowledged David Sassoon's attempt to be faithful both to his religion and loyal to the Queen at the same time. Quote, "It is no exaggeration to say that while the poor and needy exist in this land, Mr. David Sassoon cannot well be forgotten. And while he abated nothing of his love for his ancient people and his ancient faith, he ever felt a peculiar pride in being a subject of the British crown." One should take these rosy words with caution. David Sassoon did throw in his lot with the British. He needed a homeland for his family and his fellow Baghdadi Jews. But they faced constant discrimination from the British. And though David became increasingly insulated from its effects as he rose in wealth and prestige, he no doubt had to weigh even business deals very carefully so as not to alienate the powerful British. And the Jews would always face some form of anti-Semitism from the British and would be routinely barred from institutions such as clubs. Many of David Sassoon's benefactions had nothing to do with the Raj. Shortly before he died, David donated funds for a hospital, another neo-Gothic building in Pune, designed by the same architect, Sinclair Wilkins, same architect as the nearby synagogue, and also sporting a clock tower. As Bartle Frere said at the laying of the first stone in the presence of David David, here in this hospital, those in need would be given aid, quote, "without distinction of race or rank or age or sex or station." At the time, it was very rare to find hospitals that admitted all groups and all castes due to notions of purity, ritual purity, and propriety, which were important for Hindus, for Parsis, and for Jews. Greater proximity to the British also implied an increasing distance from the Indian Jews of Bombay, the Bene Israel, who had lived in India since time immemorial and were indistinguishable from the Indians. The Bene Israel had little economic clout, and their modest synagogues could hardly be distinguished from their domestic buildings. The Sassoons were Orthodox, or the Bene Israel had inevitably lost touch with some of their Jewish roots and rituals. The Baghdadi Jews were becoming increasingly anglicized. The Bene Israel, as you can see here, the contrast remained staunchly Indian. Since the British discriminated against both Indian and Baghdadi Jews, the Baghdadis wanted to be considered Europeans as a way of separating themselves from the Bene Israel, that is the Indians. So discrimination ran both ways. According to the charity trust, which Jacob had soon left to fund the Sassoon buildings after his death, the Bene Israel were expressly excluded from attending the school at the Magen David compound, but you will soon see how this changed. Yet the influence of India on the Sassoons was significant. In their private homes and even in their offices, where they wanted comfort and protection from the climate, their buildings were characterized by an inspired hybridity. The lattice screens made of wood recalled the jalis of Islamic and Hindu architecture in India. The buildings are porous, allowing for the breeze to enter, cutting down direct sunlight in the interior and protecting it from the sun. The Sassoons' dependence on the British undoubtedly implied both political and cultural accommodation. David sided very strongly with the British, even during the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the first War of Independence. Yet the Baghdadis were both empowered and constrained by their entangled relationship with the British. Living as he did as a foreigner in a colony imposed from above on the rightful inhabitants, David also showed sensitivity to local needs, erecting public buildings for the Indian citizens of Bombay and Pune, all of which are still in use today: a hospital, a library, a reformatory, and an old folk home. In 1862, David donated a large sum for the Mechanics Institute, now the David Sassoon Library. This was an expensive building on expensive soil, a centrally located Rampart Row. And one of the challenges, given the current state of research, is to restore the names of the other peoples who contributed to these buildings. Here you see among the architects and engineers, There's the distinguished Parsi engineer, a major figure, Muncherji Koasji Mursban, if I'm pronouncing this correctly. He was responsible for most of the detailing and was really almost a public figure in Bombay. And this is extremely important. David did not live to see the completion of the library, which was overseen by his son Albert. But after his death, the governor of Bombay and Bartolfrere and several friends commissioned the British sculptor Thomas Woolner to make a full-size statue of David for the library. John Lockwood Kipling, father of Rudyard Kipling, did the medallion on the facade, which you see here. So David's effigy is on the public realm, and so one of the reasons he's so well known in Bombay today. The quality of the Bombay craftsmanship is superb. The high Victorian Gothic is all about detail, intricately carved capitals with fruits and foliage, stained glass, beautiful metalwork, and imported Minton tiles. This little gem of a building is as much loved today as it was then. As the photographer Amay Mansabdar noted, quote, "It is one of the few remnants of a Bombay that exists only in sepia-toned memories." This is not nostalgia for the Raj, but for the many fine buildings that were destroyed to make way for the featureless high-rises that impoverish the cityscape. Another great contribution of David Sassoon is the former Victoria and Albert Museum, renamed the Dr. Baghdadi Jews Museum in honor of the renowned philanthropist and Sanskrit scholar. When the authorities decided to create Bombay's first museum in 1862, David was one of the main donors, together with his friends Jamsetji Jijiboy, Parsi, and Jagannath Shunkarseth, who I believe is a Hindu. Sassoon also paid for the clock tower built in the garden of the museum, which also has a posthumous bust of David Sassoon. If David also gifted to the museum a marble statue of Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, who had given the impetus to the original Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and to the decorative arts, which is the brief of this museum. And the statue is by Matthew Noble, and it has a dedicatory inscription paid for by David, the whole thing, in 5 languages: Marathi, Gujarati, Persian, English, and Hebrew. Had David survived a few more years, he would have seen this interior, but he would not have seen what is there now. When he died, Bartolfrere and other friends commissioned Woolner to make a bust of David. Needless to say, a devout Jew would have shuddered at infringing the second commandment against graven image, including them himself, but therefore in Bombay, all posthumous, because of the admiration of the public. Now, the statues of both Sassoon, and here you see, he is in front of the prince, and you see the first inscription you see is in Hebrew. So he was not just subservient to the Raj, he also affirmed his Jewishness with great pride and put it in the public realm. That's the first inscription that you see. And the statues of both David Sassoon and the prince have survived partition and post-independence. As the current director of the Museum of Bombay, Tasneem Zakaria Mehta, pointed out in 2011, the entire museum was always seen as a leftover of the British. Quote, "It's only now when we are comfortable with ourselves and can look at our British legacy and not be self-conscious about it that we can say this is also a part of our legacy and part of our history." This would have been unthinkable 30, 40 years ago. David Sassoon's sons and grandsons followed in his shoes. Albert, the eldest, took over the maintenance of all his father's charitable causes and built several projects that benefited the population, including the Sassoon Docks and the Elphinstone Technical High School, another monumental building beautifully sited at the edge of the Maidan. The massive neo-Gothic structure, clad in stone and perforated by 3 stories of porticos, provide coolness and to the interior classroom, but they're one of the strategies used by the British architects and engineers to adapt the neo-Gothic to the local climate. and the Bombay craftsmen carved the imaginative capitals, and there are dozens inside this building, and created the superb wrought iron metalwork that you see in the three arched entrance. This was one of the schools, a first-rate school that prepared students for the university exams and offered teaching in several languages. And this is another much loved institution, as I found out from a host of messages from former students on Twitter. Jacob Sassoon, David's grandson, part of the third generation, was born and died in Bombay. An extremely important patron of architecture, Jacob left one synagogue in India and two in China. In the center of Bombay, prime real estate, he built the Knesset Eliyahu, together with his brothers, the most beautiful, I believe, of the three beautiful synagogues that the Sassoons left in India. A neo-Renaissance building with two windowed stories resting on a rusticated base. And now there's been beautifully restored by Abba Narayan Lamba, India's top restorer. You see the contrast between the dark blue facade with the crisp white stucco ornamentation. The interior shows a sharp discontinuity with the classicizing exterior, and the exquisite interior is breathtaking in it because it's airy and diaphanous. There's a gossamer-like character of the spindly columns and supporting elements that do not obstruct the passage of light. And you see the gilt-edged details that send a play of golden light dancing into space. It is absolutely, it has been exquisitely restored. Jacob Sassoon was also involved with textile mills and transformed his father's company into India's largest textile conglomerate, exporting cloth to Asia, the Middle East, and Britain. I should say that there were two Sassoon firms. I'm not going to go into it. Both of them were involved with the textiles. But it was the American Civil War that prompted the entrance of the Sassoons into the production of cotton, since the Confederate ports were blocked from exporting cotton to Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool. India, they saw their chance, the Sassoons saw their chance, and India produced cotton. And so they began exporting cotton and eventually fabricating, producing textiles and piece goods. So David, the father, bought an old mill called the Alexandra Mill, which had been abandoned, and began to refurbish it. He died before he could finish it. It was finished by his sons, and you see, it is a magnificent Renaissance basilica with exquisite details in teak wood. And in other words, the sons made sure this was a piece of culture, not just a piece of industry. And we will see that this is extraordinarily important today. Now overgrown with trees, it looks like a 19th century Angkor Wat going there. Meanwhile, again, as all this was being built, the Sassoons were the same Sassoons were active in China. But China was a very different matter. The family's sons and grandsons all spent a few years in Hong Kong and Shanghai, but their stay there was only temporary, a few years to learn the intricacies of the family business. Home was Bombay, or after the late 19th century, London. It was opium that took the foreign traders there initially, and the Sassoons left a large number of office buildings and rental properties, but do not seem, given the current state of research, to have left public buildings like libraries and hospitals. In Hong Kong, all their buildings but the synagogue have been destroyed, which is why it's so hard to do research. And this was a very different atmosphere in Hong Kong and Shanghai from Bombay. Discrimination against minorities was rampant, and against the Chinese majority, brutal. Stylistically, the buildings in China, at least in the Sassoons' early days, in fact, all the Westerners' early days there, were much more eclectic than in Bombay and almost improvisatory. Both Hong Kong and the international settlement in Shanghai saw feverish building activity without the architectural standards that one saw in Bombay. That would come, it would come later. Jacob Sassoon built synagogues in both places with the help of his brothers. In Hong Kong, the eclectic Ohio, which you see on your left, was originally much more workmanlike before it was totally rebuilt. In Shanghai, of course, the synagogue built 20 years later has much more gravitas and the heavy, quasi-mannerist details. And in Shanghai, I should say, most of the existing contributions, much more remained there, but most of things that remain were built when when Victor Sassoon, the fourth generation, chose to make his home in the city, almost 100 years after his great-grandfather arrived in Bombay. Now, in 31, when Victor Sassoon arrived in Shanghai, it was a metropolis of almost 3 million people, 2,700,000. This is a map only of the international settlement. The rest of Shanghai goes beyond the scope here. Now, when they arrived in the 1840s, all they found was the old Chinese city. And according to the treaties agreed with China, the French were given this little slot here to build as a foothold, and the British were given that one. But over the years, they wrested more concessions from the Chinese, and they continued to grow. The American settlement was over here, the Japanese there, and the Russians had a little part over there. But make no mistake, how many foreigners were there? They fluctuated between 60 and 70,000, most of them Japanese, in a city of almost 3 million people. So the Chinese were the main inhabitants of all this part, 400,000 here and almost 1 million in the international settlement. Now Victor Sassoon, unlike his grandfather, did not want to blend in, but to stand out. He wanted to chart his own path through modernity, and architecture was one of his means of self-fashioning. With provocative sang-froid, he boldly forged his path, breaking stereotypes, provoking people, building the first skyscrapers in Shanghai. Opium had long since disappeared, and he diversified the family's portfolio even more, striking out in the hospitality business, erecting several hotels and upscale residential suites. These were not public, but semi-public buildings aimed at very wealthy people, but they were all built on public streets, and as such had an impact on the public realm. Shanghai is one of the world's Art Deco capitals, and these buildings, all the buildings left by Victor, are much admired, which is why they have survived. The most famous of his buildings is Sassoon House, an iconic building on the Shanghai waterfront, the Bund, which housed one of the most luxurious hotels in the world, the Cathay, that occupied the top 4 floors and the tower of this magnificent Art Deco skyscrapers. Victor's buildings were all cutting-edge technology. This part of Shanghai was once underwater. So to build on this waterlogged soil meant to lay foundations above hundreds of feet of mud. And Victor was able to do this thanks to his Chinese contractor, Sinjin Qi, who in fact built a floating concrete raft supported by 1,600 piles. This is the technology. The interiors of all Victor's buildings were sleek and stylish. One might say that he created a skyscraper style of his own. He was in the hospitality business after all, and the architecture had to be seductive inside and out. The Cathay Hotel was known for its exquisite decorative details. In contrast to most Westerners who were building in Shanghai at the time, Victor made a point of including beautiful Chinese detailing and ornamentation, expertly executed by Chinese craftsmen. By the same token, all his companies had high-ranking Chinese directors and trustees, prized positions that heretofore had been reserved for Westerners. And he also made sure that Chinese would feel welcome in his hotels and nightclubs. But even Victor, in the Cathay and other hotels, had signs on his bathrooms for ladies, gentlemen, and Chinese, which caused an uproar and had to be changed. You could no longer do that in Shanghai, and he changed them. Victor's skyscrapers stand out by Victor, not just by virtue of their quality, they've all been restored in recent years, but also because of the urbanism. And here you see Hamilton House and the Metropole, which constitute urban scenography at its most spectacular. In an imaginative, brilliant urban gesture, their slightly concave Art Deco facades frame Fuzhou Road like gigantic bookends. And this goes back to a famous piece of town planning in 17th century Rome. As you entered the Piazza del Popolo, the main road at the time was Il Corso, framed by these 2 churches, but I've never seen this applied so imaginatively and applied to skyscrapers. And these buildings would have been innovative even in New York. They had sprinklers in every room. They had trash chutes. They have dumb waiters where the food would be sent up. I mean, everything Victor did had to pass, had to be as advanced or more advanced than what you could see in New York, which was what he was looking at. Now, Victor's embankment building on the Suzhou Creek is equally famous and has been described by the historian Shen Zhongwei as embodying, quote, the social structure of old Shanghai, both its cosmopolitanism and its colonialism. And you can see the latter here. From the air, it's VS. Can you see the V? And then the S. Victor was not self-effacing. This was a path-breaking high-rise condominium with courtyard, central heating, which was new, and a swimming pool on the ground floor. The embankment building is a massive concrete structure, and because of its prominent location and desirable location, the top 3 floors were added in 78 to make room for more tenants. And they just completed a 3-year restoration, and this building is highly prized by artists, writers, and people in film and the graphic arts. I would now like to address the subtitle of this talk, an architectural heritage, which of course begs the question, whose heritage? The answer to that can only be provisional. Architecture has an unstable meaning, which changes as the structure outlives those who made them and first used them, or when the buildings become embroiled in political or social upheavals. In the case of the Sassoons, the circumstances were particularly dramatic. The Japanese occupation of Shanghai, 37 to 45, the partition in India in 47, and the Chinese Revolution in 1949. And yet, the Sassoon's architectural legacy has endured to take on new meanings over the years. And the meanings of Victor's buildings changed radically with the arrival of about 20,000 European Jews in Shanghai. Victor was a major donor, the biggest donor in Asia. He helped fund the International Committee for European Immigrants and was deeply involved with other Baghdadi Jews in helping refugees who arrived fleeing the Nazis. At the luxurious Sassoon house, he assigned several offices to the committee on your left and spaces for a thrift shop where the refugees could sell their valuables. Victor also set aside the first floor of the embankment building to register, feed, and temporarily house the new arrivals. As this was hardly sufficient for the influx of refugees, he allocated another of his companies, the Aero Concrete Company, to house refugees. As the years passed, other associations rafted themselves onto Victor's 3 most important buildings. Associations which had nothing to do with him, but amplified their significance. The Cathay Hotel was badly damaged in the Battle for Shanghai, 1937. Here is the 2 photographs. This is 1937. It was bombed. In the event, it wasn't bombed by the Japanese. It was friendly fire, I'm sad to say. The Chinese accidentally bombed it. They were trying to reach the Izumo, a Japanese warship in the bay. But there it is. But the point is, because the Chinese were on the same side, this building is now part of the battle, the resistance against the Japanese. More destabilized received associations. Thus, quite apart from its significance as a jewel of Art Deco, the Cathay became a symbol of the resistance of Shanghai. Another example is the embankment building, which was occupied by the troops of Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang during its unsuccessful last-ditch effort against the People's Liberation Army. So they were holed up here, and the PLA was around it until they surrendered. And history continued to haunt Victor's buildings even after his death. During the Cultural Revolution, the Hamilton House and the Metropole were stripped of all their beautiful Art Deco decorations, and the Metropole became the Jingjiang Hotel. But it too was visited by historic figures. There you have it. The entire American delegation was housed at the Metropole, except for Richard Nixon and his wife, who were housed in another building of Victor's Grosvenor House. So As you see here, Nixon is anxiously looking at the food. He had never eaten Chinese food in America, so he was given a tutorial and taught how to use chopsticks and how to praise the food, which he did incessantly. And it worked beautifully, most of the time at any rate. Now, looking back on these two different cities, where the Sassoons built extensively, one can say the Victor's projects in Shanghai were not meant for the Chinese or for the Baghdadi Jews. But in harnessing them to a higher cause, he ensured that they would be part of Jewish as well as transnational, as well as art historical heritage. They also resonate in history for reasons that had nothing to do with him. The bombardment of 37, the Kuomintang, or Nixon's historic trip. But this is also heritage, the heritage that exceeds personal memories. In India, however, it's quite different. The staying power of Sassoon buildings had to do with many things. They were public, they were beautiful, they were meant to last, and they were made for the Indians. There was no reference to the Raj except in the Neo-Gothic style. And they're still being used, all of them, for the same purpose for which they were built. Their lasting significance can be gauged by the degree to which the Sassoon's most impressive structures have been subject to loving and careful restoration. The tiny Jewish community left in Bombay could hardly afford to restore the Knesset Eliyahu, let alone to engage India's most top restorer, Abba Narayan Lamba, to do it. The World Monument Fund came up with a plan which was paid for by the Jindal Southwest Foundation, one of India's leading steel conglomerates. This is important. This is not Jewish money. And the foundation funded the restoration because this synagogue was acknowledged and is acknowledged as an important part of the city's heritage. And it won a prize. And the success of the restoration of Knesset Eliyahu led the same foundation, the Jindal Southwest Foundation, to commission the same architect to restore the David Sassoon Library, which we opened last week. And with an important change. As you can see here, flat roof, but it originally had a pitched roof, which means it had a truss ceiling. And Abba Narayan Lamba, this is what was there until the restoration, and she did a truss ceiling. She's not she's not historicized, she's not imitating, but she's evoking the past with a period appropriate lamps. It's a very beautiful work of restoration. And I should say that the mills that we saw, the Sassoon mills that look like a Renaissance basilica, are also being restored to be India's top and largest textile museum. A city with over 100 mills, they chose the two Sassoon mills to restore because of their beauty. So social change, finally, to end, can also radically transform the scope of heritage. When we were visiting, Claudia Nasson and I were visiting the Magen David, the first thing we saw inside the temple were a group of men with enormous sacks of rice, lentils, sugar, tea, and putting them into smaller sacks, as you see here. So we asked Solomon Sofer, the president of the tiny Baghdadi Jewish community left in the city, and I actually asked him, are the Jews here undergoing hard times? He said, he looked at me in surprise. He said, this is not for the Jews, this is for the Muslims. This entire area is Muslim. And so I asked, what about the Jacob Sassoon High School, which you see in the back? He said, well, we have a handful of Christian students, all the others are Muslim. They learn about Judaism. Who's paying for this? The Sir Jacob Sassoon Fund. The same Sir Jacob who had said that his school was not for the Bene Israel, and they also help pay for the other synagogues, also Huna, also the library, or they contribute. But here it is that fund that is responsible for that. So by restoring these buildings at the highest level, the citizens of Bombay are not appropriating this heritage. It was always there, but they are adding an important layer to the meaning of these buildings. Restoration is a form of self-inscription. David Sassoon is still very much in the picture steps, especially because his face is everywhere, or there are 4 different statues of him. But the building becomes, as it were, a palimpsest, where you have David Sassoon and you had the Indians who were with joy, and they love these structures. But I will also say that we should ask ourselves who or what produces meaning in architecture. Well, that's an open-ended question. Here we can see that the generosity of the Sir Jacob Sassoon Fund and its trustees is making heritage of this synagogue or constituency. Many Baghdadi Jews still remember their marriages, their bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs in the synagogue. But today, the fond memories of the synagogue are not only on the side of the Sassoons or the Baghdadi Jews. So the Sassoons' architectural patronage has to be seen through many different prisms, including a post-colonial lens. This is, after all, a colonial story in post-colonial times. And the Sassoons could hardly have anticipated the vicissitudes that nearly 200 years since their departure from Baghdad would come to pass. And although David Sassoon's descendants would eventually leave Indian China, their buildings remain, custodians of memories past, and vessels through which the future is taking shape, a future they could not have anticipated. Thank you.
Absolute treat that was. I mean, that was an extraordinary talk that took us halfway around the world and back again, and it was so conceptually rich as well as visually and historically. I could ask you a million questions, but I'm not going to because that would be unfair. What I'm going to see is, are there any questions in the room? And if there aren't, I will ask a million questions.
Well, I'd just like to ask, do you know at all how the textile mills, what the timetable is for the textile mills to be?
They have,
I can't find it out.
I can't find it out because it's very slow. So we were taken to visit them and they said they were working on it, and they were. So online, you can just see a tiny little piece, which is nothing. Now, Abd Narayan Lamba wanted to restore them and had a plan, which you perhaps, you can just go down, sorry. Oh, I won't be able to find it. Anyway, she had a plan to restore it, but right now it's the Greater Association of Mumbai that is doing, it's the municipality itself that is restoring it, and they're slow. My guess is a question of money. Had it been her, we would have found money to back it, because it's extraordinary what she's done. And this was, I mean, these two buildings that she restored. This is the top. She is extraordinary. This is the very top, and it shows the care that they feel for these buildings.
1937, Shanghai. Was it KMT, that bond?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, the nationalist Chinese, did they bond the Sassoon hotel by mistake?
So the Chinese bombed, but it was an accident.
Or were they nationalist?
They were not. Yes, they were. They were on the same side as Victor Sassoon.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
But they're not communist.
no, they were not. Sorry, I should have made that clear. They were not communists, and so they were on the same side. And Victor was in the building, as were hundreds of guests and workers. And he ran out. He was like Siegfried Sassoon, you know, Mad Jack. He just ran out and narrowly got hit by a Japanese. And the Japanese later came to apologize. So, but it was, and this was caught on film, which I'm not able to bring up here, but it was caught on film at the moment as it was being filmed, as it was being bombed. It was extraordinary. Within seconds, the cinematographers were there sending it across the world. So this was a major thing. So this is the thing that Victor's buildings during the war, beginning with the occupation of Japan, resonate with history.
Could you maybe say a bit more about the congregation of the other Baghdadi Jews in the 19th century? Were they also merchants? Were they funding similar
in Israel?
Yeah, or I suppose you said as well, Sassoon was bringing over kind of members of his community from Iraq or other Jews.
Yeah. They were working largely on the textile mills, and so the Sassoons had what has been described as a welfare system. They had schools for all levels, and they trained these people who came from Baghdad. So that some would go into finance, others would go work in administration. So they had a whole setup, and they provided everything: health services, religious services, funerals, or everything. And so they worked for, they were targeted, they were educated and worked for the many, thousands of them worked on the textile mills of Bombay. It was only very late that they began to include other people.
So they're not wealthy, other wealthy Jewish families at their own time.
Thank you. So they weren't all wealthy. And it's a very good question that you asked, because the wealthy Baghdadi Jews spoke Hindustani. The poor Baghdadi Jews spoke Marathi, like most of the population, because they went to schools where they were in the same schools as others who were speaking Marathi. So, and they remained less anglicized than David, his sons and grandsons. Yes, thank you for asking that.
I like very much this discussion of the hybrid nature of the buildings and the Farsi engineer, for example, on one of the projects, and about the workers who or the builders. Were you able to find more information about the builders they employed, for example, who would have had different experiences with say non-Western, non-Gibbs-like buildings, for example, in either Mumbai or Shanghai or elsewhere? I just wonder about the builders and what you may have found about them.
Nothing. I'm afraid I found, that's why I was saying that we need our South Asian colleagues to do, we wouldn't know where to look, quite frankly. In Shanghai, for example, there was a lot of discrimination against the Chinese, but the Chinese, when Victor arrived, it was very different. It was very different from the earlier decades. So he was working with a certain level with colleagues. He did not use any of the Chinese architects because he was using a lot of refugees as engineers as well. So the contractors are very important because they are like engineers. Sinjin Ki, who appears here and who worked for him several times. But I noticed, I did find the names, but these are high-placed people. So the builders themselves, we know nothing. Thank you.
Very sort of subjective question, actually. When you refer to the buildings in India as being neo-Gothic and sort of following the English tradition of neo-Gothic, they struck me as being kind of more Byzantine in the way that, say, that was also happening in Britain at the time, this kind of Byzantine style. So is there a kind of synthesis taking place? Is this all coming out of his Turkish, his Ottoman past, this unique synthesis of what you call neo-Gothic, and then what I instinctively perceived as being a kind of cross between Byzantine and neo-Gothic?
These are what we call high Victorian Gothic or even Venetian Gothic, which is a misnomer. They should be high Bombay Victorian Gothic because they are adapted to the climate. They have a degree of craftsmanship done by hand, which is superior. What they had there was the Indo-Saracenic with the domes that sometimes resembles the Byzantine, also in the details. And so you're walking around Bombay, and above the clouds, way above, you see a dome rising, which could be Byzantine, but also could be Muslim. And that's the Indo-Saracenic, which we now considered a colonial artifact because it was an invented style. But many of the buildings in Bombay, or some of the buildings, were actually designed by British architects who never went there. Normal Shaw never went there. Gilbert Scott, the Victoria Station, they designed the whole thing, which is why. But they don't look British. They have a vitality and a vibrancy in the detail that's quite extraordinary. So, and I'm sure that if I looked, I would find the Neo-Byzantine because it was around at that time. But not these buildings, I would say. But you are right that there were some of the styles used by the Raj, and there were a great many, and they built very well. They had very good schools, they had great architects, but the local people who also built were of extraordinary quality, which explains why Bombay is so exquisitely beautiful. Thank you for asking that. Yeah.
No, I mean, I was greatly struck, but I'm going to take two more questions before I do anything. I mean, just how much they owed, you know, how by the middle of the 19th century, you've got Ruskinian Gothic that's being used here. You've got that kind of Indo-Saracenic stuff that's happening. And the synagogues, none of them look like synagogues that are being built in Britain or Europe at the time, almost all of which are evoking, you know, Indo-Saracenic Ottoman architecture in a way that he obviously isn't. So there's a sort of deliberate decision not to evoke his own homeland, which is not being made in England.
Exactly. The last thing they wanted was to be considered Oriental. So they had.
It's really striking. It's
It is
really
striking,
striking because in England, what they want to be is considered Oriental because they want to avoid the association with the Ashkenazim in some senses. But yeah, there's a question at the back. Yes.
Yes, a bit early. So thank you so much for this talk. I was quite intrigued by your use of the term hybridity, because as a art historian of medieval Spain, this is something I struggle constantly. So I wanted to ask, what's your understanding? What's your take on hybridity as a methodological term?
What was you were using the word hybrid, and so the sort of question, what's your definition of hybrid?
I was talking about the houses where you can see some Indian references, but it's eclectic. It's some of it coming from the Hindus, some of them coming from the Muslims, and some of them coming from Great Britain. So in that sense, they were hybrid. But also, I would say that even the great Gothic, the neo-Gothic buildings, we see there was a hybridity there because it was a Gothic that was a Bombay Gothic, and that I think we do them a disservice when we keep saying high Venetian, high Victorian Gothic, and we do away with the local contribution to this.
Yeah, there is an indigenous kind of, yes.
Yes, it was just a related question to the question about builders, and I just wanted to see how difficult your task actually is, because to what extent are the papers of the Sassoons, do they exist, or all the commissioning documents there? Do we know what their motives, to what extent were they involved at the involved end of the spectrum in stylistic decisions? And on the other side, to what extent have the congregations, particularly in relation to the synagogues, do their papers exist, or are you left just having to do the sort of visual comparative analysis? I just got one point that Professor Whyte just mentioned about England, and Pune strikes me as an amazing example, because it's part of such a small group of neo-Gothic synagogues worldwide. Many of them were destroyed in places like Vienna in Germany, obviously, and of course in England it was pretty much sort of forbidden to build in England in that style, apart from in Wales, where a most amazing neo-Gothic synagogue was built, which is due to become in effect the Jewish Museum of Wales. But I'm just interested in your archival sources, because this is the usual frustration, isn't it? So.
As I mentioned before, it's all to be done.
Yeah.
We have found very few plans. The plans that exist, and unfortunately the plans that exist, for example, Port Lim, or for example, David Sassoon Library, we have the plans for that. The problem is they were not carried out. It wasn't built as the plan. So that is the one building in Bombay for which we have plans and elevations, but it included a huge hall in the back, and that was never built. So we can't, so the architect had to judge all the things that weren't built, the things that we know from old photographs, but old photographs are not architectural plans, so it's very complicated. There is some material in Jerusalem, but we could not go there. So there's a villa I didn't show you, Il Palazzo, owned by Flora Sassoon, and that we have the plans. Campbell, the architect, we have the plans. They're not online, so we didn't see them. That is one of the major problems, is that I had to reconstruct the architecture without any plans to go on. And that, so it's this is not how architectural history is done. You go from the inside out. I had to go from the outside. And as for the ideas of the Sassoons, I don't know I have found now recently some speeches by David Sassoon. He didn't speak English. The speeches are in English, therefore they were translated. So we have to take that with a grain of salt. But I cannot believe that so I'm saying that he is looking at Christchurch because it was a few minutes away, and he is very clearly, and I know that he was a man who saw himself as the father of this community, and he did nothing without thinking about them. So even when he thinks that you think that he's imitating the British, he is thinking of the Baghdadi Jews.
The extraordinary thing is that what you have really, don't you? I mean, this is why the concept of heritage is so, and inheritance is so interesting, is you've got a family, as you say, that begin with utter mobility and continue to move, you know, in this way, and yet are investing these huge sums with the assumption that they'll be built to establish a new sort of community, to establish a new kind of,
Yes.
you know, and that this will go on, that this will endure. I mean, at what point do you think? So 1830 is when he arrives from Baghdad, and within 1832, within sort of 10, 15 years, he's building huge things.
Yes, and leaving money for the future. And this I find extraordinary, that the Sir Jacob Sassoon is still there doing amazing things. And I should also add that the Muslims repay the compliment in Calcutta. The synagogues, the 3 synagogues, have been cared for over 100 years by the Muslims. Families, father to son, father to son. It's an extraordinary, and at a time of resurgent ethno-nationalism in India, to see these two communities coming together, the time when the Muslims are being criminalized and persecuted, to see this friendship that has been there for a very long time, it was very moving. But you're right about anyway. There's the first part of you.
Well, the first part was simply, you know, the process by which it becomes clear that he is staying in Bombay, and that this is going, you know, this is forever.
Yes, and then these children, the sons, all but 2, end up in Britain, and they disagree, and the grandsons disagree with the taste of the parents. So when Albert Sassoon, his eldest son and heir, builds a neo-Mughal, I can't really explain it, tomb for himself in Brighton, Philip Sassoon, his grandson, who is the most educated, refined, and an art historian, a man of great knowledge, he is horrified. He was British. I mean, this is not it. So he yanks the father and the son out and has them put in another cemetery. So the children and the grandchildren have different tastes. And then you have Victor, who said, no, I'm my own person. I'm going to do what I want, and leaves this extraordinary legacy behind.
Philip, isn't it, who's famous for saying, take down the Union flag, it's clashing with the sunset. But the interesting thing about it, is you've got this extraordinary hybridity, and you've got this extraordinary variety in which, as you say, you've got kind of Rum Bogenstiel, you've got Ruskinian Gothic, Bombay Gothic, you've got India Sennacherib. And there's nothing from his origins, and there doesn't seem to be an evolution of a distinctively Jewish architecture here.
No.
And why do you think that is? None of that is something you can point to.
Well, each of these generations had different ideas. They had different languages and different cultures, and so it becomes very complicated. The one interior, Oriental interior, which I found was not built by the Sassoons, and that is Sybil Sassoon at Kensington, had a smoking room. She bought it, which was neo-Muslim or Orientalist, and that was the only way she bought it. It wasn't her choice. They didn't go for that. They wanted to be, when they arrived in Britain, they wanted to be British, and of course, that was it. And they became their cultural capital that they showed as British collective was extraordinary. They could outpace and outdo the others with their knowledge, and they became scholars, which is also extraordinary about the Sassoons.
Let me show you, just before we finish, the book.
I paid them to say that.
Yes. It's every bit as beautiful as the images we've been shown, and filled with the most remarkable, exciting insights into the broader thing. So, you know, go and buy a copy now, and, you know, But let us finish there and simply say thank you so much for a fascinating and generous and intellectually stimulating account. And we will all go away and not just read your book, but buy your book. Thank you very much. Thank you.